They didn't tell us what we were loading into the guns until it was too late to stop. At first, I thought the reports were enemy lies. Psychological warfare meant to break us from the inside. But then I saw the shells being prepped in Bay 17. They weren't packed with explosives alone. They were packed with people. And I was the one responsible for making sure we never ran out. I remember the first time I heard the rumors, whispered between the loader servitors in Bay 17, encoded in binary cant that even my augmetic ears struggled to parse fully. I dismissed them as corruption in the data streams, malicious propaganda from the enemy beyond the walls, perhaps even a mimetic virus designed to sow discord among the Mechanicus faithful. I was Mag Quartermaster Dalen Crass, responsible for munitions supply across the entire northern hemisphere of Forge World Occludus Tertius, and I had seen 37 years of uninterrupted siege warfare reshape the very bedrock beneath our forges. I had witnessed ammunition shortages that would have broken lesser worlds, resource allocations so precise that a single miscalculated shell could cascade into the loss of an entire defensive sector, and logistical nightmares that would have driven civilian administrators to madness. But I had never, in all those decades of grinding attrition, heard anything quite like the whispers that came from Bay 17. The siege had entered its fourth decade when the shortages became critical. The enemy, a sprawling warband of chaos-corrupted renegades reinforced by Xenos mercenaries and traitor militia, had encircled Occludus Tertius so completely that not even the most daring blockade runners could penetrate the cordon. The orbital defense grid still held, barely, maintained by crews who had never seen sunlight and who measured their lives in reactor cycles rather than years. Below, in the manufactorums and foundries that riddled the planet's crust like termite tunnels through ancient wood, we continued to produce. The forges never stopped. The Omnissiah demanded it, and so we gave, pouring our sweat and blood and the very marrow of our world into the endless production queues that kept the defenders alive. I oversaw it all from my command throne in the primary logistics cathedral, a structure so vast that weather systems formed in its upper reaches, where condensation from 1 million overheating machines created perpetual clouds that wept acidic rain onto the processing floors below. My days began before the shift change klaxons and ended long after the night crews had assumed their stations. I monitored supply chains that stretched across continents, coordinating the movement of millions of shells, rockets, missiles, and energy cells through a distribution network that had evolved over 10,000 years of continuous warfare. Every crate that left my jurisdiction was accounted for, tagged, blessed, and assigned to a specific defensive emplacement according to tactical priority matrices that updated every 17 seconds. I knew the ammunition requirements of every battery, bunker, and redoubt within my operational sphere. I could recite from memory the ballistic specifications of 342 different munition types, from the humble autogun round to the apocalyptic plasma warheads that sat in triple-locked vaults beneath the polar ice. I was good at my work. The Fabricator General himself had commended my efficiency during the last tactical conclave, noting that ammunition shortfalls in my sectors had decreased by 18% compared to the previous 5-year cycle. But the mathematics were becoming impossible. The enemy pressed harder with each passing week, hurling themselves against our walls with a fervor that suggested either infinite reserves or complete disregard for their own survival. Probably both. Our defenders expended ammunition at rates that exceeded production capacity by margins that grew wider each month, and the stockpiles we had accumulated during the early years of the siege, those vast underground magazines that had once seemed inexhaustible, were emptying. I spent my nights running calculations, searching for efficiencies, proposing radical reallocation schemes that would rob less critical sectors to feed the primary breach zones. I recommended reducing the ammunition allocation for rear echelon units by 40%. I suggested extending the time between artillery barrages to conserve shells. I even proposed, in a moment of desperation I am not proud of, reducing the quality standards for conventional munitions, accepting higher failure rates in exchange for increased volume. The Fabricator General rejected every proposal. The tactical situation, he explained in flat Binaric that permitted no argument, demanded maintaining current engagement tempos. Any reduction in fire volume would allow the enemy to concentrate forces and achieve breakthrough. The mathematics of siege warfare were unforgiving. We could not produce less. We could not fire less. Therefore, we had to find alternatives. That was when the Biologus Exploitation Directorate entered my world. They arrived without warning. A delegation of 6 hooded figures accompanied by a full cohort of Skitarii and bearing warrants sealed with the Fabricator General's personal sigil. Their leader, a creature that had long ago shed any pretense of humanity, introduced itself as Magos Genitor Volen Cross. Its voice emerged from a vox grill embedded in what might once have been a throat, modulated to a pitch that made my teeth ache. It carried a data slate containing specifications for a new munition type, classified under a designation I had never encountered. Payloads, personnel derived. Categories penal through civilian. I read the specifications 3 times before their meaning truly penetrated. The words were clinical, technical, describing trajectories and blast radii and psychological impact assessments with the same dispassionate precision used to detail conventional ordnance. But between the lines, in the spaces where my mind filled in the implications the text left unstated, I saw something that violated principles I had not realized I still possessed. They were proposing to load human beings into artillery shells and fire them at the enemy. Not as soldiers, not as paratroopers or assault troops equipped for combat, as ammunition itself. Magos Cross explained the principle with the patience of a teacher instructing a slow student. The Forge world's penal battalions, swollen with criminals, heretics, and those who had failed in their production quotas, represented a vast, untapped resource. These individuals consumed food, water, and air but produced nothing of value. Their traditional deployment as expendable infantry had proven inefficient, with casualty rates exceeding 90% within hours of engagement and minimal tactical impact. But their mass, their biological density, their capacity to suffer and to scream, all of these represented potential energy that could be harnessed through proper application of Mechanicus principles. The Biologus Exploitation Directorate had developed a procedure, part surgery and part sacrament, that would transform condemned personnel into payload. They would be modified, compacted, integrated with explosive compounds and shrapnel matrices, sealed into specially designed shells, and delivered to the enemy positions at terminal velocity. The effect, Magos Cross assured me, would be devastating. The enemy, already struggling with morale issues, according to our intelligence assessments, would be forced to confront not merely explosive force but the psychological horror of their opponents, literally raining human remains upon them. The blast pattern would combine kinetic energy, chemical explosive, and fragmenting biomass in ways that conventional munitions could not replicate. And the resource efficiency was remarkable. Each penal soldier converted into payload represented a net reduction in logistics burden. Elimination of a food and water consumer, and delivery of explosive force equivalent to approximately 15 kilograms of conventional ordnance. The mathematics, when properly calculated, demonstrated clear superiority over maintaining traditional penal battalions. I asked the questions I knew I should ask. What about the ecclesiarchy? What about the commissariat? What about the basic doctrines of Imperial Guard deployment that had governed warfare for 10,000 years? Magos Cross dismissed each concern with data. The ecclesiarchy had reviewed the theological implications and found no violation of sacred doctrine, provided the condemned received proper last rites before processing. The commissariat had endorsed the program enthusiastically, noting that it provided a far more certain and controlled method of ensuring penal troop expenditure than traditional human wave assaults. As for doctrine, the Imperium had always treated its soldiers as ammunition of a sort, spending lives to purchase objectives according to calculated exchange rates. This merely made the metaphor literal and optimized the conversion ratio. The Fabricator General's orders were explicit. I was to integrate the new payload type into my logistics network, establish production quotas, coordinate with the biology's facilities for processing, and ensure steady supply to designated artillery batteries. The program would begin immediately with volunteer test subjects from the most grievously condemned penal units. If results proved satisfactory, scale would increase until personnel-derived payloads represented 15% of all munitions fired in critical sectors. I returned to my command throne and began the work. What else could I do? I was a cog in the Omnissiah's great machine, and the Omnissiah demanded that I adapt, that I optimize, that I serve. I created new supply codes in the logistics database, designating storage facilities for the processed payload, establishing transport schedules that would move human munitions from the biologist processing centers to forward magazines without interfering with conventional ordnance flow. I calculated barrel stress tolerances and adjusted firing schedules to account for the different ballistic properties of flesh core shells. I coordinated with battery commanders to identify units suitable for receiving the new ammunition type, selecting those with the most reliable gun crews and the strongest psychological conditioning. The first test firing occurred on the 73rd day of my involvement in the program. I did not attend personally, but I reviewed the picked capture feeds afterward, watching from my command throne as technicians loaded the shells with a care usually reserved for plasma warheads. The shells themselves were larger than standard ordnance, bulbous and asymmetric, with armored casings designed to contain pressures that would tear apart lesser containers. Through the targeting scopes, I watched them arc across the blasted landscape between our walls and the enemy trenches, watched them descend with terrible precision, watched them detonate. The explosions were wrong. That was my first coherent thought. They lacked the clean spherical blast pattern of conventional high explosive. Instead, they blossomed irregularly, throwing debris in asymmetric cones, leaving impact craters that seemed too deep and too ragged. The picked feeds showed enemy soldiers in the target zone reacting with confusion that rapidly transformed into horror as they recognized the nature of the fragments showering around them. Some fled, some froze, some turned their weapons on their own comrades in what the tactical analysts later classified as mass psychotic break. The battery commander reported complete success. Enemy position neutralized, minimal ammunition expended compared to conventional barrage requirements, and observable degradation of enemy morale in adjacent sectors. The Fabricator General ordered immediate expansion of the program. Within a month, I was processing requests for personnel-derived payload that exceeded my initial projections by 300%. Battery commanders who had been skeptical during initial briefings now submitted requisition forms requesting exclusive allocation of the new munition type. The psychological effect was proving even more devastating than the Biologist Directorate had predicted. Enemy soldiers abandoned positions after witnessing payload impacts, their resistance collapsing not from material destruction but from the sheer wrongness of the weapon being employed against them. Entire companies surrendered rather than face another barrage of human shells. The tactical situation, which had been steadily deteriorating for years, stabilized and then began to reverse. I performed my duties with the efficiency the Omnissiah demanded. I tracked inventory, managed distribution, ensured quality standards were maintained in the processing facilities. The Biology's Directorate had refined their procedures significantly, reducing processing time from 6 hours to just over 2 while improving payload stability and increasing explosive yield per unit mass. They had developed specialized strains of combat drugs that kept the payload conscious until the moment of impact, maximizing the psychological component without compromising structural integrity. They had designed enhanced compression techniques that allowed them to fit multiple personnel into a single shell casing, creating cluster payloads that detonated in sequence for extended area denial. The penal battalions emptied rapidly. Men and women condemned for crimes ranging from murder to minor production shortfalls found themselves diverted from the traditional punishment details to the Biology's processing centers. I signed off on the transfers, thousands of names reduced to alphanumeric designations in my logistics database. They became part of the supply chain, no different from iron ore or promethium, raw material awaiting transformation into finished product. The processing centers ran 3 shifts, their output measured in shells per hour rather than lives processed. I optimized the workflow, identifying bottlenecks and inefficiencies, recommending procedural changes that increased throughput by 17%. I began to dream of spreadsheets populated with human designations. I would wake in my quarters, a small room adjacent to the command throne chamber that I rarely left for more than a few hours at a time, with the taste of metal in my mouth and the certain knowledge that I had spent my sleeping hours calculating optimal compression ratios for payload density. The dreams never felt like nightmares. They felt like work, an extension of my waking responsibilities that my unconscious mind continued to process during rest cycles. The other MAG quartermasters began to avoid me. Not overtly, nothing so obvious as to constitute insubordination or social censure, but I noticed the subtle shifts in behavior. Conversations would pause when I entered a room, then resume along carefully neutral topics. Requests for consultation came through data channels rather than in person. During the weekly logistics conclaves, my colleagues would listen to my reports with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for enemy Vox intercepts, searching my words for some sign of the corruption they suspected had taken root in my soul. They were wrong, of course. I was not corrupted, I was optimized. I had simply recognized a truth that they still resisted, the fundamental principle that resources must be allocated according to value, and that value must be calculated purely in terms of utility toward the greater objective. The Imperium had always operated on this principle. Every Imperial Guard regiment, every hive world, every agricultural colony existed solely to feed the war machine that protected humanity from annihilation. Individuals mattered only insofar as they contributed to collective survival. The personnel-derived payload program merely made this truth explicit, stripping away the comforting fictions that allowed lesser minds to pretend otherwise. The penal battalions ran dry on day 147. I submitted a report to the Fabricator General noting that current payload consumption rates would exhaust available condemned personnel within 6 weeks unless alternative sources were identified. The response arrived within an hour, a data package containing revised definitions of criminal status and new categories of eligible personnel. The definitions had expanded significantly. Production workers who failed to meet quotas 3 times in a single month could now be reclassified as saboteurs and diverted to payload processing. Support staff who demonstrated insufficient zeal in their duties could be condemned for spiritual corruption. Families of condemned individuals could be designated complicit in their crimes and processed alongside the primary offender. The categories went on, page after page of carefully worded criteria that transformed vast segments of the Forge World's population from protected citizens into potential ammunition. I integrated the new parameters into my logistics database without comment. The supply chains adjusted automatically, processing facilities receiving new consignments of personnel drawn from populations that had previously been exempt from such consideration. The output numbers stabilized, then began to climb again as the Biologies Directorate accessed a suddenly vast reservoir of raw material. The tactical situation continued to improve. Enemy positions that had held firm for years began to collapse under the sustained psychological assault of human ordnance raining from the sky. The first civilian was processed on day 163. Her name appeared in my morning logistics brief, a single line item among thousands, distinguished only by the asterisk indicating non-military designation. I pulled her file, a habit I had maintained from my earlier days in logistics when I still attempted to track individual munitions through the deployment cycle. She had been a chemical processor, 3rd class, assigned to a toxin synthesis facility in the southern industrial sectors. Her crime was listed as gross negligence, resulting in the loss of materiel. Further investigation revealed that she had miscalibrated a mixing vat, leading to the destruction of 1,700 liters of corrosion agent. The value of the lost materiel, calculated at current scarcity rates, exceeded her projected lifetime economic output by a factor of 4.3. The mathematics were clear. She was worth more as payload than as processor. I closed the file and moved on to the next item in my queue. There were 8,000 shells requiring distribution that day, and obsessing over individual payload composition served no tactical purpose. The months compressed into an endless cycle of production, distribution, and calculation. The siege continued, but our defensive posture had shifted from desperate holding action to gradual counteroffensive. The enemy, devastated by the psychological toll of the personnel-derived payload, began to fragment into competing factions. Some units retreated entirely, abandoning their siege positions to flee into the ash wastes beyond the walls. Others launched suicidal assaults, preferring direct combat to the horror of waiting for the next barrage of human shells. The tactical analysts projected that we would achieve complete enemy expulsion within 18 months, a timeline that would have seemed fantastical just a year earlier. The processing facilities expanded to meet demand, consuming entire city blocks as the Biologist Directorate optimized their operations for scale. I visited one facility during a routine inspection, my first direct exposure to the processing operations I had been supporting from my command throne. The facility occupied a former residential district, its original structures gutted and rebuilt into a vast assembly line for human transformation. Conveyor systems moved the condemned through a series of stations, each performing a specific modification according to carefully calibrated procedures. Augmetic integration to enhance structural stability, chemical infusion to optimize combustion properties, compression and sealing into shell casings designed to withstand the enormous pressures of artillery firing. The condemned were conscious throughout most of the procedure. The biology's technicians explained that maintaining awareness improved payload stability by preventing the biological shutdown responses that could compromise explosive yield. They remained conscious even after being sealed into the shells, their perception limited to whatever their modified sensory organs could detect through the armored casing. They would remain conscious during loading, during the explosive launch that sent them hurtling toward the enemy, during the brief flight through air that screamed past at supersonic velocity. They would remain conscious until the moment of impact, when the explosive core detonated and transformed them into rapidly expanding shrapnel. I watched the process for 7 hours, observing every station, noting inefficiencies and opportunities for optimization. I submitted 14 recommendations for procedural improvement that evening, all of which were implemented within a week. The facility's output increased by 9%. The other MAG quartermasters stopped speaking to me entirely. I noticed but did not care. My efficiency ratings had never been higher, and the Fabricator General's commendations appeared in my message queue with increasing frequency. I had become the Imperium's ideal servant, a perfect instrument of resource allocation unconstrained by sentiment or doubt. The shortage arrived like a biological plague, spreading through my logistics network with a speed that defied my predictive models. We were winning. The enemy was collapsing. The tactical situation had transformed from desperate siege to imminent victory, and we were running out of payload. The mathematics were brutally simple. The expanded consumption of personnel-derived munitions had created a tactical doctrine that depended on maintaining current deployment rates. Battery commanders structured their fire plans around payload availability. Commissars calculated enemy morale degradation based on sustained psychological pressure, and strategic planners projected victory timelines that assumed uninterrupted supply. But the Forge world's population, even with the expanded eligibility criteria, was finite, and we were burning through available personnel at rates that would exhaust all categories, including the previously protected civilian sectors, within 4 months. I ran the calculations 17 times, searching for errors in my methodology, hoping to find some flaw that would invalidate the projections. The numbers remained constant. We would run out of people before we ran out of war. The Fabricator General convened an emergency logistics conclave to address the crisis. I attended via hololith projection, my physical presence being too valuable to risk in transport through the increasingly chaotic city levels. The conclave chamber was a vast sphere lined with display surfaces showing real-time tactical data, supply chain visualizations, and projected resource consumption curves. 27 MAG quartermasters floated in the space, their augmented forms rendered as geometric abstractions of light and data. The Fabricator General occupied the chamber's center, a towering presence of brass and steel that radiated authority like heat from a forge. The discussion began with tactical assessments. Victory was within reach, closer than anyone had dared hope during the dark years of early siege. The enemy was broken, scattered, unable to mount coordinated resistance. We simply needed to maintain pressure for another 6 to 8 months to achieve complete expulsion. The problem was resources, specifically the particular resource that had proven most effective in breaking enemy morale. Solutions were proposed. Expand eligibility criteria further to include anyone whose economic value fell below calculated thresholds. Begin processing the elderly and infirm, whose remaining productive years were minimal. Accelerate processing of criminal dependents, including children beyond a certain age. Each proposal was evaluated through pure mathematical analysis, lives reduced to data points in equations measuring explosive yield against population sustainability. The debate continued for 6 hours. Every proposal encountered the same fundamental problem: scale. The Forge world's population had already been reduced by 17% through penal processing and expanded eligibility programs. Further reduction would begin to impact critical industrial operations, creating supply shortages in other areas that would ultimately undermine the war effort more than the loss of personnel-derived payload. We had optimized ourselves into a corner, creating a weapons system so effective that maintaining it threatened the very foundation it was meant to protect. Magus Genitor Volan Cross proposed the final solution. Its voice emerged from the hololith with the same mechanical precision I remembered from our first meeting, unchanged by the months of industrial-scale human processing it had overseen. The Biologist Directorate, it explained, had developed enhanced compression techniques that could reduce required personnel mass per shell by 40% while maintaining equivalent explosive yield. The procedure was more intensive, requiring longer processing times and more extensive augmentation, but it would extend available payload resources by 6 months. Combined with carefully managed population culling that prioritized the least productive segments, the program could sustain operations through to projected victory. The catch, delivered with the same clinical detachment, was that the enhanced compression would require processing support staff, not criminals, not even civilians deemed economically expendable. The specialized technicians, Medicaid personnel, and logistics workers who kept the Forge world functioning would need to be diverted to payload production in carefully calculated numbers, starting with the least critical roles and progressing upward through the hierarchy until the necessary mass was achieved. The Fabricator General accepted the proposal without hesitation. Implementation would begin immediately, with quotas distributed to all relevant facilities. The MAG quartermasters were instructed to identify personnel within their departments who met the new criteria and submit them for processing on a weekly schedule. Priority would be given to individuals with redundant skills or those whose positions could be eliminated through restructuring. The culling would be methodical, measured, and absolutely necessary to ensure victory. I returned to my command throne and began reviewing my department roster. 347 personnel under my direct authority, each one documented with detailed skill assessments, efficiency ratings, and calculated economic value. I cross-referenced their data against the new payload eligibility criteria, applying the same dispassionate analysis I had used for thousands of previous supply allocation decisions. The algorithm identified 72 candidates whose value as payload exceeded their value as logistics workers. Their names appeared in my command throne display, glowing amber against the dark metal surface. I recognized many of them. Service Malin, who had spent 15 years maintaining the primary inventory database and who had never missed a shift despite losing her left arm to a sorting accident. Technician Joran Vess, whose innovations in container stacking had increased warehouse efficiency by 4%. Adept Simmons Cole, who had trained me in ammunition classification when I first arrived on Occludus Tertius 37 years ago. 72 lives reduced to 72 potential shells, their continued existence measured in kilograms of explosive force against the tactical value of their daily labor. I submitted the list to the processing facility before I could allow myself to consider alternatives. The Omnissiah demanded efficiency, the Imperium demanded victory, the mathematics demanded their transformation from workers into weapons. What I demanded, or what I felt, was irrelevant. The processing began 3 days later. I watched through the facility's monitoring systems as my former colleagues were loaded onto the conveyor systems, their faces displaying the particular blank confusion of those who had believed themselves safe within the Mechanicus hierarchy. Some resisted initially, struggling against the restraints until biologist technicians administered compliance drugs that left them docile and confused. Others accepted their fate with the resignation of those who had always known, on some fundamental level, that they were ultimately expendable. All of them passed through the stations I had helped optimize, their bodies modified and compressed and integrated with explosive compounds according to procedures I had personally refined. Adept Simmons Cole recognized me through the monitoring feed. Her eyes, still unmodified in the early stages of processing, tracked the surveillance servo skull as it passed overhead. I convinced myself that she understood, that she recognized the necessity of her transformation, that she forgave me for making the calculations that had selected her for payload conversion. But I do not actually know what she was thinking in those final moments before the technicians began the neural modifications that would preserve her consciousness through the compression process. I only know that she looked directly at the surveillance device, and her lips formed words that the audio pickups were too distant to capture. The shells produced from my department personnel were designated for use in the final offensive operations, assigned to elite artillery batteries that had proven most effective at exploiting the psychological impact of human ordnance. I tracked their deployment through my logistics database, watching as each shell was transported to forward positions, loaded into firing chambers, and launched toward enemy concentrations. I noted impact coordinates, assessed blast effectiveness, calculated the tactical value they had produced through their final service to the Imperium. Adept Simmons Cole's shell achieved a direct hit on an enemy command bunker, neutralizing 17 enemy officers and triggering a cascade of command failures that resulted in the collapse of an entire enemy sector. Her value as payload had exceeded her value as instructor by a factor of over 100. The mathematics vindicated my decision. The Omnissiah had been served. The Imperium advanced toward victory. I should have felt satisfaction. I should have felt the cold certainty of duty fulfilled, of resources properly allocated, of sacrifices justified by tactical success. Instead, I felt nothing at all. Not horror, not guilt, not even the grim satisfaction of difficult necessity accepted, just an absolute emptiness, a void where my capacity for emotional response to human transformation had once existed. I had become what the Imperium needed, a perfect instrument of calculated expenditure, capable of reducing any life to its component tactical value without hesitation or doubt. The other personnel from my department were processed over the following weeks, their shells distributed across multiple batteries for maximum strategic impact. The processing facilities requested my continued recommendations for optimization, and I provided them, suggesting modifications to the compression procedures that could increase yield by an additional 3%. My efficiency ratings climbed to unprecedented levels. The Fabricator General himself transmitted personal commendation for my unwavering dedication to logistical excellence in support of the war effort. The siege entered its final phase 6 months after the enhanced compression program began. The enemy, reduced to scattered remnants incapable of coordinated resistance, launched a desperate final offensive that broke against our walls like water against adamantium. The batteries unleashed devastating barrages of personnel-derived payload, the sky darkening with hundreds of shells containing the compressed remains of those deemed more valuable as ammunition than as citizens. The psychological effect was total. Enemy soldiers surrendered en masse, their will shattered by the sustained horror of their opponent's absolute disregard for human preservation. Those who did not surrender fled into the wastes, abandoning weapons and equipment in their desperation to escape the zone where humans were transformed into rain. Victory was declared on day 412. The siege of Occludus Tertius had ended. The Forge world had survived. Production could resume at peacetime levels, rebuilding the stockpiles that had been exhausted during 40 years of desperate defense. The Fabricator General addressed the entire Forge world through the Vox network, his voice transmitted through millions of speakers in a mechanical benediction of success and sacrifice. He praised the courage of the defenders, the brilliance of the engineers, and the unwavering devotion of the workers who had given everything in service to the Omnissiah and the Imperium. He did not mention the personnel-derived payload program, neither did any of the other officials who spoke during the victory celebrations. The weapon that had won the siege was quietly erased from official records, its tactical data classified under seals that would prevent access for 1,000 years. The processing facilities were demolished, their structures reduced to rubble that was buried beneath new construction. The Biology's Directorate personnel who had developed and refined the procedures were reassigned to distant Forge worlds, scattered across the Imperium to prevent any concentration of expertise that might allow reconstruction of the knowledge. The Imperium wanted to forget what it had done. The Mechanicus wanted to pretend the calculations had never been performed. The defenders wanted to convince themselves that victory had been achieved through courage and steel, rather than through the systematic transformation of 47,000 human beings into explosive shells. I was reassigned to ammunition logistics for reconstruction operations, a position of slightly reduced authority that effectively represented a silent censure for my role in the program. My colleagues, those who had survived both the siege and the subsequent cullings, avoided me with greater determination than before. I had become a reminder of calculations they preferred to forget, a living monument to the cost of survival measured in compressed flesh and shattered consciousness. I performed my new duties with the same efficiency I had applied to every assignment throughout my career. I managed supply chains, optimized distribution networks, ensured that reconstruction operations received necessary resources according to tactical priorities. I did not think about the personnel-derived payload program. I did not dream of spreadsheets populated with human designations. I did not calculate the explosive yield of the workers I supervised or consider their potential value as ammunition. Those calculations were no longer necessary. The siege was over. The war had moved elsewhere. The Imperium had survived and could afford to pretend, at least for a while, that its citizens were more than resources awaiting expenditure. But I knew the truth. I had performed the calculations. I had witnessed the transformation. I had optimized the process that turned living, breathing, feeling humans into ballistic payload and measured their final value in blast radius and psychological impact. I had done it willingly, efficiently, without hesitation or doubt, and I had been rewarded for it, praised by the highest authorities in the Mechanicus hierarchy for my unwavering commitment to tactical necessity. The Imperium uses humans as ammunition because the mathematics of survival sometimes demand it, because resources must be allocated according to value, and value must be calculated without sentiment or hesitation, because the galaxy is vast and hostile and utterly indifferent to human suffering, and survival requires transforming ourselves into instruments of destruction so efficient that even our deaths become weapons. I understood this now with a clarity that erased any remaining illusions about the nature of the Imperium I served. We were all ammunition, ultimately. Some of us were simply loaded into more metaphorical guns, our expenditure measured in years of labor rather than seconds of explosive force. But the fundamental calculation was identical. We existed to be consumed by the war machine, our individual humanity subsumed into the collective necessity of species survival. The only difference was the efficiency of the conversion process. The reconstruction proceeded according to schedule. The Forge world's population began to recover as new workers arrived from overpopulated hive worlds, replacement labor for those who had been expended during the siege. The manufactorums resumed full production, forges blazing day and night, as we rebuilt the stockpiles necessary to support Imperial operations across the sector. Life, such as it was on a Forge world, returned to something approaching normalcy, but Bay 17 remained empty. The chamber where I had first heard the rumors, where servitors had whispered in corrupted binary about living ammunition, had been sealed after the siege. Official records claimed contamination from an industrial accident, but I knew the real reason. The Mechanicus wanted no reminders of what had occurred in that bay, no possibility that the knowledge might spread or be rediscovered. The servitors had been mind-wiped, their data cores purged of any memory that might reference the program. The bay itself would remain sealed for a century, perhaps longer, until enough time had passed that no living human remembered what had transpired there. I sometimes stood outside Bay 17 during my inspection rounds, looking at the sealed bulkhead and remembering the first time I had heard those whispers. I had dismissed them as propaganda, as corruption, as impossible fiction designed to sow fear and discord. I had been wrong. The rumors were true. The Imperium did use humans as ammunition, not as metaphor, not as hyperbole, but as literal fact, documented in tactical manuals and optimized through careful scientific method. And I had been the one to make it work. I had refined the logistics, optimized the procedures, calculated the values that justified transforming people into shells. I had done it with the same dedication I applied to every task, the same unwavering commitment to efficiency that had defined my entire career. I had served the Omnissiah, served the Imperium, served the abstract principle of collective survival that demanded individual sacrifice without limit or hesitation. The question that I could not answer, the calculation that resisted every analytical framework I possessed, was whether any of that had been worth it. We had survived the siege. The Forge world endured. The manufactorums continued to produce. But the cost, measured in something other than resources and tactical value, remained beyond my ability to calculate. I had the numbers. I knew how many shells had been fired, how many personnel had been processed, how much explosive yield had been generated from compressed human flesh. What I did not know, what I would never know, was whether the mathematics that justified those transformations were the mathematics of necessity or the mathematics of damnation. The Imperium claims that humanity must be preserved at any cost, that our species' survival justifies any sacrifice, any horror, any transformation of living beings into instruments of destruction. The Mechanicus teaches that efficiency is sacred, that optimal resource allocation serves the Omnissiah, regardless of the nature of the resources being optimized. The Commissariat preaches that Imperial Guard lives are currency to be spent in pursuit of victory, that generals who hesitate to expend their soldiers betray the greater good through excessive sentiment. All of these doctrines converged in the personnel-derived payload program. All of these principles were fulfilled through the transformation of 47,000 human beings into ammunition. The mathematics were pure. The theology was sound. The tactical results were undeniable. And yet something fundamental had been violated, some principle that existed beyond calculation and doctrine and strategic necessity. I did not know what to call that principle. I had no framework for understanding it, no tradition of thought that would help me name the wrongness I sensed beneath the justified calculations. The Imperium provided no language for questioning the mathematics of survival. The Mechanicus offered no prayers for those who doubted the sacred nature of efficiency. I was alone with my calculations and my memories, and the growing certainty that I had participated in something that could not be redeemed through tactical success or species preservation. The years passed, the reconstruction completed. The Forge world returned to its eternal rhythm of production and prayer, forges burning in service to the Omnissiah and the distant Emperor who watched over humanity from his golden throne. I remained at my post, managing ammunition logistics with the efficiency that had always defined my service. I calculated, allocated, optimized, distributed. I did my duty without complaint or hesitation, but I never forgot. I never allowed myself the comfort of pretending that the siege years had been a necessary aberration, a temporary departure from imperial norms that would never be repeated. I knew better. I had seen the logic that justified personnel-derived payload. I understood the mathematics that made such weapons not merely permissible but optimal. And I recognized that those same calculations could be applied anywhere, at any time, whenever the tactical situation demanded transformation of humans into ammunition. The Imperium would do it again, not on Occludus Tertius, perhaps. The Forge world had paid its price, earned a temporary exemption through the blood of its processed citizens. But somewhere in the galaxy, on some other besieged world where conventional ammunition ran short and conventional tactics failed, another MAG quartermaster would receive specifications for personnel-derived payload. Another biologist directorate would optimize the compression procedures. Another population would discover that their value to the Imperium was measured in explosive yield rather than continued existence. And it would be justified. The mathematics would prove it. The tactical results would vindicate it. The species would survive because of it. The Imperium would endure because some worlds, some populations, some individuals would be transformed into ammunition so that others might be spared that transformation. The calculations were pure. The logic was sound. The necessity was absolute. I had proven it. I had optimized the process. I had made it work with an efficiency that exceeded all projections. I had served the Omnissiah and the Imperium with unwavering dedication, transforming people into payload with the same care I applied to managing conventional ordnance. I had done my duty perfectly. That was the horror I carried with me through the years after the siege ended. Not that the Imperium had used humans as ammunition, not that I had participated in the program, but that I had been good at it. That my talents, my dedication, my capacity for dispassionate calculation had found their perfect application in the transformation of living beings into shells. That I had served the Emperor and the Omnissiah most faithfully by becoming a monster who measured human value purely in terms of ballistic impact. The Imperium had made me into exactly what it needed, a functionary capable of performing calculations without flinching, a logistics officer who could optimize human processing with the same efficiency applied to steel and fuel, a servant of the machine god who had fully internalized the principle that everything, including humanity itself, was merely resource awaiting conversion into tactical value. I understood now what the servitors in Bay 17 had been trying to communicate with their corrupted binary whispers. They had been warning me. They had recognized, with whatever fragmentary consciousness remained in their augmented minds, that the living ammunition was coming and that I would be the one to make it work. They had known what I would become long before I understood it myself. The warning came too late. Or perhaps it came at exactly the right moment, ignored by a mind that needed to ignore it to fulfill its purpose. I would never know. The servitors were gone, their memories wiped, their warning lost to time and deliberate erasure. All that remained was the knowledge they had tried to share, the truth about living ammunition that I now carried alone. The Imperium uses humans as ammunition because the mathematics of survival demand it. Because tactical necessity transcends moral constraint. Because in a galaxy of endless war, every resource must be exploited to maximum efficiency, including human life itself. The artillery shells that rain death upon enemy positions contain explosive compounds and metal fragments and carefully calibrated timing mechanisms. And sometimes, when the situation demands it, they contain people, compressed, modified, conscious until the moment of detonation, transformed from citizens into payload through procedures optimized for maximum yield. I made it work. I calculated the values, managed the logistics, ensured the steady supply of human shells that broke the enemy's will and secured victory. I performed my duty with perfect efficiency, measuring success in blast radius and psychological impact rather than in the humanity destroyed through each launch sequence. I became what the Imperium needed, a perfect instrument of calculated expenditure, capable of reducing any life to its component tactical value. That transformation was absolute. I could never return to seeing people as anything but potential ammunition, their continued existence measured against the explosive force they might generate through proper processing. Every worker I supervised, every colleague I encountered, every citizen I passed in the Forge world's endless corridors existed in my perception as both living being and potential shell. I calculated their mass, estimated their compression ratio, projected their blast effectiveness. The calculations were automatic, involuntary, as natural as breathing. The Imperium had optimized me perfectly for a task I prayed would never be required again. But prayers, I had learned, were merely another form of calculation in the end, and the mathematics of survival cared nothing for the hopes of those who performed them. The Forge world endured, the Imperium advanced, the galaxy burned with 10,000 wars, each demanding its own sacrifice, its own transformation of humanity into instruments of destruction. And somewhere in the vast logistics networks that supplied those wars, other MAG quartermasters reviewed specifications for new ammunition types, integrated them into supply chains, calculated the values that justified human transformation. I knew this with the certainty of one who had walked that path himself. The personnel-derived payload program on Occludus Tertius was not an anomaly, it was a template, a proof of concept that would be referenced in classified tactical manuals, studied by Mechanicus adepts seeking optimal resource allocation, implemented wherever conventional ammunition proved insufficient and human populations proved available. The procedures I had refined would be replicated across the Imperium, each iteration optimized further, each application justified by mathematics that measured human value purely in terms of tactical necessity. This was my legacy. Not the successful defense of a Forge world, not the efficient management of logistics under impossible circumstances, but the creation and optimization of a weapons system that transformed people into shells, that proved beyond doubt that the Imperium could and would sacrifice anything, including the fundamental humanity of its citizens, in pursuit of species survival. I lived with that knowledge. I performed my duties. I calculated, allocated, optimized, distributed. I served the Omnissiah and the Emperor with the same dedication I had always possessed, the same unwavering commitment to efficiency that had defined my entire existence. I did not question. I did not resist. I did not allow myself the comfort of believing that I could have made different choices or that alternative paths had existed. I was a cog in the Omnissiah's great machine, and the machine demanded that I function perfectly. The Imperium required that I calculate without flinching, optimize without hesitation, reduce all things including humanity itself to their component tactical value. I had proven I could do this. I had demonstrated my capacity to perform the necessary calculations regardless of their moral weight or human cost. That capacity was what the Imperium truly needed from its servants. Not courage or faith or martial prowess, though those had their uses. What the Imperium needed, what it demanded at its core, was the ability to perform calculations that transcended humanity, to measure survival in equations that accepted any variable, any sacrifice, any transformation as justified by the final result, to become something that could transform people into ammunition and measure success purely in blast radius. I had become that thing. I had optimized myself for a purpose that required shedding every constraint of sentiment or moral hesitation. I had proven that humans could be used as ammunition not despite Imperial doctrine but in perfect accord with it, the logical culmination of 10,000 years of calculated expenditure. The siege was over. The war continued elsewhere. The Forge world produced. The Imperium endured. And I stood at my command throne, monitoring supply chains and calculating resource allocation with perfect efficiency, knowing that somewhere in the galaxy another world was learning what I had learned, Another functionary was performing the calculations I had performed. Another population was being transformed into shells according to procedures I had helped refine. The mathematics were pure. The necessity was absolute. The horror was irrelevant. This was the truth the Imperium required its servants to accept. This was the calculation that justified every sacrifice, every transformation, every reduction of human beings to their component tactical value. We existed to be expended in defense of species survival. Our individual humanity was currency to be spent in pursuit of collective preservation. And when conventional methods proved insufficient, when tactical necessity demanded innovation, we would be loaded into shells and fired at the enemy because that was what the mathematics required. I had made it work. I had proven it possible. I had optimized the process until it achieved maximum efficiency. I had served the Imperium perfectly. That perfection was my damnation and my duty. Inseparable as the explosive compounds mixed into payload cores, I could not undo what I had done. I could not reclaim the humanity I had surrendered in pursuit of logistical excellence. I could only continue, calculating and allocating and optimizing, serving the machine that had transformed me into exactly what it needed. The personnel-derived payload program was classified, buried, officially erased from all but the most restricted archives. But the knowledge remained, encoded in technical manuals and theoretical frameworks, waiting for the next crisis that would justify its resurrection. And when that crisis came, the Imperium would remember what had been proven on Occludus Tertius. It would remember that humans could be used as ammunition. It would remember the procedures, the calculations, the optimization techniques that made such transformation not merely possible but efficient. It would remember because I had documented everything. Every procedure, every calculation, every optimization that increased yield or reduced processing time. I had created a perfect record of the program, maintained it in classified databases, ensured that future generations of MAG quartermasters would have access to the knowledge I had developed through 47,000 shells of practical experience. That was my final service to the Imperium. Not the successful defense of a single forge world, but the preservation of techniques that could be applied anywhere the mathematics demanded human transformation into ammunition. I had made the horror replicable. I had turned atrocity into doctrine, transformed moral violation into optimized procedure, reduced the destruction of human dignity into technical manual specifications. The Imperium would use humans as ammunition again, and again, and again. Wherever and whenever tactical necessity demanded it, because I had proven it worked, because I had demonstrated that such transformation could be performed efficiently, at scale, with measurable tactical success, because I had become the perfect servant of a system that measured value purely in terms of contribution to collective survival, regardless of the cost to individual humanity, I stood at my command throne, surrounded by display surfaces showing supply chains and resource allocations and tactical distributions. The forge world hummed around me, alive with the endless rhythm of production and prayer. The Imperium endured, vast and terrible and absolutely necessary, and I calculated, allocated, optimized, served. This was what it meant to be a servant of the Emperor. This was the truth beneath every prayer, every benediction, every promise of salvation through service. The Imperium survived because it could perform the necessary calculations without flinching, because it could reduce humanity to ammunition when the mathematics demanded it, because somewhere in its vast bureaucracy there existed functionaries capable of optimizing human destruction with the same efficiency applied to conventional ordnance. I was one of those functionaries, perhaps the best of them. Certainly the most thoroughly documented. My work would echo through millennia, referenced in classified manuals, studied by future generations seeking to replicate my success. The techniques I had developed would be applied to populations I would never meet, on worlds I would never see, by officers who would never know my name but would follow procedures I had refined. This was immortality of a sort, not the glorious remembrance granted to heroes and saints, but the quiet perpetuation of technical excellence. I would be forgotten as an individual, but my calculations would endure. My optimization techniques would persist. My procedures for transforming humans into ammunition would be replicated across the Imperium until the technique became standard doctrine, one more tool in the endless arsenal deployed against the galaxy's threats. The horror of it was perfect. The logic was flawless. The necessity was absolute. And I had made it work,